the same time. Okay, so that is now recording. I'm also going to set the timer so that we don't overrun. And I'm going to keep that chat box open, but to the side so that I can monitor it during the session. Okay, now it's my experience with these kinds of sessions that people sort of join as we start. I can see Anne has joined us, Anne Stenbaum, I think, from...
Correct.
Okay, Anne, would you like to just quickly use the chat box to tell us your name, your location, and who you work for? Just your first name. Actually, you better put your first name with an E because there's two Annes on the session.
Let me just find the chat box.
You know how to access the chat box. You need to go down to the bottom if that's where your control
panel
panel
is. Okay. Yes, got it. Yeah,
okay,
fine.
great stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, tell me again. What would you like in there?
Yeah, it's at the top of the chat box. Please tell us your name, your location, and who you work for, and what you want to take away from this session. The most important single thing you want to get out of the session. Now, we've had about 15, I think, in total book onto the session, but I can see there's only the two of you joined us so far. But in the interests of timekeeping and also, you know, to honor the fact you're on time, I'm going to start the session now. So I hope you're all safe and well and somehow making the best of the situation. It's an interactive session, so I invite you to keep your microphones unmuted, keep them on, and you know, keep your cameras on. You can hear both of us. Belinda, just say hi.
Hi, both hands.
Hello.
You can hear us. Okay.
Hello, Belinda.
You can hear both of us. So many of us are pretty much Zoom experts, I think, by now. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded. It will be shared with others who've booked but who can't attend the event. So just be mindful of that when sharing any information or if you're asking any questions, etc. And I'll need to keep a tight rein on the timing because 30 minutes is going to go really quickly. Now, we'll make sure that the recording of the session is available on our YouTube channel, and you'll automatically get a follow-up email which will have a link to this recording, plus also a copy of the slide deck we're using. So just a quick introduction of who we are. Let me get the slide up. So I'm Colin Newbold, and I'm basically the head of the TLC online organization, of which Click 360 is our flagship brand of 360-degree feedback. And my lead facilitator and coach is Belinda Kiley, who has guided multiple organizations through many 360 projects in her time. And she's going to be leading this session. Now, as most of you know, this is the third of 9 group mentoring sessions. And these are designed to share best practice when it comes to 360-degree feedback implementations. So if you haven't done so already, please use the chat facility to introduce yourselves. And while I encourage you to jump in verbally at any time with questions or observations or suggestions, if you prefer, you can always post into the chat box, which I will be monitoring. Now, how we want to work with you is to deliver short bursts of information accompanied by 1 or more slides, and then open up the floor to you guys. And before I hand over to Belinda, I just want to say that out of all of the 9 sessions that we're running, this is probably the most important, you know, in terms of maximizing or even eradicating your 3 biggest obstacles to rater engagement. Here they are. In many respects, I liken the awareness briefing to the preparation that a good decorator does before, you know, applying any wall covering or paint. In some ways, that's the easy bit. Same with gardening. You know, I don't know if you're gardeners, but it's all about preparing the soil before planting. So, on that note, I'm going to hand over to Belinda, who will share her screen so she's in control.
This is where the technology bit. The message that comes up saying I can't start sharing until you stop.
Okay, try that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I will just start the slideshow, and hopefully everybody's seeing the slides. Is that okay?
We can see them, Belinda. Thank you.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So as Colin said, you know, the three biggest obstacles that we've found is around getting slow take up, but also it's to do with the low level of response that you get from raters and also poor quality feedback. And so the briefing awareness helps incredibly in changing those and bringing down those barriers. So what we're looking for really from the briefing awareness is to get participant commitment and rater engagement. And just so we're talking same language, when we say the participant, that's the person being rated. That's the person who's ultimately going to get the feedback. When we talk about the rater, that's the person who's providing the feedback, and we'll use those terms throughout. So directly, the briefing awareness is going to give and ensure you've got the participant commitment, and it's through that the participant can then maximise the rater engagement that they get. So what do we want to see from what makes up an impactive briefing awareness? These would, for me, these are the objectives really of an impactive briefing awareness. It's going to help explain the context, clarify the process, address fears and apprehensions, but most importantly also inspire the participant to really engage with the process. So part of it is about education, but also you can see that a key part of it is also about mindset, about making sure that our participant is in the right place to actually get the most out of the process. We're going to look at each of those elements in turn. The first one about the context. When I talk about the whys, to me that part of that is about the business context, particularly if this is part of a wider leadership development program. Why is the business doing this? But also importantly, what's in it for the participant themselves? When we're launching this as part of you know, a big program, I think this is really where there can be great value in asking for the commitment and engagement of some of the leadership team in delivering those business messages to really drive home why it is so critical to the business. I think for me as well, it's also about explaining how the output will be used. Where I think mistrust comes into 360 is where there isn't transparency. So where it's not clear, is it being used for development purposes? Or is this actually really about assessment, but we're dressing it up as a development tool? And when I talk to organisations that maybe they've had problems with 360 in the past, it's because that has not been clear. And it's about setting expectations of who will see that data and how it will be used. I think
Belinda,
particularly, yeah,
sorry, Belinda, can you just let me introduce and welcome Amelia and or Emily and Maxine. So thanks for joining us. Both of you, there is an opportunity in the chat function to introduce yourselves, and in particular to tell us what you want to get out of this session. So I do encourage you to use that, and also do feel free to jump in whenever Belinda takes a breath with you know, with any kind of question or comment or suggestion or observation. We want to make this as interactive as possible. Sorry, Belinda, back to you.
Okay. So in terms of how the output will be used, I think this is where the confidentiality element really comes into play. I think particularly consider at this point as well, if you're using external coaches for your debrief, what information are they being asked to report back to organisations? If normally in most of the projects that we're involved in, what we say is that the conversations are confidential, but what gets reported back are the themes that come out that might actually help organisations be able to address some of the larger leadership development or cultural issues. But these are some of the things to have thought through in advance. And then it's about introducing the questionnaire criteria. You're probably aware of the range of questionnaires that Click 360 offer, but some organisations have their own competency frameworks, either specifically for leadership or behavioural across the board, and the questionnaires can be customised to that. Whatever the criteria is you're using, it's that openness and that transparency about what it is. So before I go on and talk about the next part of the key process, which is about explaining the process itself, are there any questions about this element? No, all quiet. So I will keep moving, but please do, if you do have any questions, do stop me. This is probably, if we were talking about a briefing awareness, this is the first thing we would think about imparting, the process itself. The rates and nominations, I think, is a really key part of the discussion around the briefing. Quite often when we talk to participants, their first reaction is to choose the people who they get on with already. They may be nervous about getting some less positive feedback. What we actually do is try and encourage them to do the flip of that and actually to look at the relationships that they would like to improve, and to consider inviting those people to participate in the survey for them. The criteria that we would say is it has to be people that work with them regularly, that see them in action. We have various different rater categories, and some of which you may choose to use within your organisation or not. But what we also have to do is to protect the anonymity, so there's got to be a minimum of 2 raters to each category, except in the case of obviously the participants themselves and their manager. So the rater nominations is important. Securing the rater commitment, I'll come on to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide, because we have a 10-step process for that. And I think by following this is where you get the greatest returns. Then explaining how they complete the questionnaire, explain your process for doing the debriefs and the action planning. If you want to know more, if you haven't yet introduced 360 in your organisations and you want to have more ideas about how best to do those, look out at the next few webinars that are coming up, because each of those areas will be covered.
Linda, can I ask you a question about the rater nominations?
Yeah.
I do think, or at least I encourage people that I work with, or I work as a coach, so I often have to set these up and do the feedback. But I would always say, choose people whose opinion you value, but don't choose people who you know are not genuinely interested in your development. Would you go along with that? Or, you know, if you know that somebody's got a problem with a colleague and they're not really out, they're out for themselves, and then they might use a questionnaire to throw in something which is, yeah, perhaps detrimental or not really in their best interest, then I would say it's not really valuable to ask people where there's a particularly difficult relationship.
I can see very much where you're coming from on that, and I think it's a valid way of approaching it. I think for me, sometimes there is an element of, if there is something not working, then it's better to find out why. If you understand why and what might be the reasons of it, then you have some choices as to whether you change the way in which you approach the relationship and how you work with that individual. So that's why when I'm positioning it, it's very much about what are the relationships that are very key in what you're trying to achieve. What are the relationships that, if they're not working, are going to stop you achieving what you want to achieve?
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add something to Anne's question and Belinda's answer? First of all, we are just about to jump in and talk about the rater invitation conversation. You'll see that one of the characteristics of our setup process is for the participant to actually be encouraged to have a conversation with each of their raters. In other words, to invite them personally, not through an email, not through some kind of global marketing comms, but through a proper verbal conversation. And we're going to go through that in a minute. But that is where the individual participant can make the choice. Well, this rater isn't the right one for me. It's not going to work. I need to move on and find somebody else. So just remember that as we go through this.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And the 10 steps that Colin talks about, this is a rather busy slide. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting you want to read it now, but there is a link on this slide, which you'll get copies of, which takes you to the full article and explains each of those steps. It might look like quite a prescriptive sort of discussion to have, but actually I think what comes out of it by the participants having this is that they will get greater commitment from the rater to give them comprehensive feedback. It's almost giving them, the participant giving the rater permission to be really open and honest with their feedback, encouraging them to not just give the scores, but also to give the behaviours, because the scores are often on their own, they're not particularly helpful. It's that combination of the observed behaviours that really makes a difference when you're trying to help somebody through a debrief and helping them think about what they want to do with their development. So this step-by-step process will help. And as Colin said, we very much come from a school of thought that says, don't send an email. Email should be your last option. Your first option should be see them face to face or pick up the phone. And certainly if you're working with a team and you're wanting your direct reports to do this, to include this as part of a team meeting or a briefing, you could do it as a group, a team as a whole, and just explain what you as their leader are looking for from the process. Any questions on that? Does that help address that for you, Anne? Great, thumbs up, brilliant. Okay, so moving on then, if we talk about participant engagement, I think when you're putting together your briefing awareness, as with any good communication, really say it's about putting yourself in the shoes of the participant. What are likely to be their concerns? What are likely to be their questions? And it's as much about what's going on in your organisation at the time, as well as what might be going on for them as individuals. And links very heavily back to the start with whys, which we talked about the context. I think it's about making sure that we're clear on responsibilities. We set up the process so that the participant is really driving it. There's nobody else there doing the administration for them behind the scenes, engaging with the individuals. It's up to them to do it. And really it's about, they will get out of the process what they put into it. And I think it's really important that we're clear about that. And wherever possible, to keep the briefing as simple as you can. And there's that balance, isn't there, between trying to get over some key messages, and also you want to explain the process, but you want to do it in a succinct way. So we want them to leave the briefing really committed to the process, but above all, seeing the value that's in it for themselves. Again, are there any questions at this point before we move on? So thinking about fears and apprehensions, I've touched on before people's previous experiences of 360. And I think, you know, if you've worked as coaches or you've introduced a program, or maybe you've experienced it yourself, some people have had less positive experiences. Some raters have used it as an opportunity to say things that they've never had the courage to say to people face to face. And has left participants quite bruised maybe in the past. And I think uncovering that and surfacing that at this stage, reassuring them about the process and about how it will support their career going forward, I think can be really helpful. The whole subject around getting the most from feedback. When we talk about feedback, we tend to talk about feedback as a gift. It is about somebody's perception, and it's a perception usually at one particular point in time. But the participant always has the choice what they do with that feedback. And I think when the participants know that, ultimately, they become more comfortable with the process. They choose what they do with it. You know, as with any gift, they may ultimately choose to put it in the cupboard. It's their choice. But ultimately, the key question always for me with feedback is around what's the impact of not doing anything? How is, if I don't act on this feedback, if I don't consider it, how will that stop or thwart my career and what I want in terms of the outcomes going forward? And I think if there's some way to have an element of your briefing awareness that addresses this, this also can set up the participant to be in the right mindset for approaching the program. Any thoughts on that? Nothing particular? Okay. So in terms of thinking about the way you deliver the briefing, we tend to do it mainly through webinars. Obviously face-to-face is if it works for you and your organisation, then brilliant. The advantage, I think, with virtual is that you can, as we are doing today, record it. You're probably likely to be imparting a great deal of information, and it can often, I think, be useful for the participants to have a reference point they can go back. It also means that for those people that you've got diary clashes, you don't have to worry then about having to repeat the process. The supporting documentation, I think, is also important, particularly, and this is where, you know, explaining the process to minimise the amount of time that you, maybe as the sponsor of the programme, have to be involved hands-on. If you can get those instructions working really simply and succinctly, then you'll have fewer queries. And in terms of timing, you know, Colin, you might have a view on this. Personally, I think it works best if you do it as close to the start of the process as possible, so that it's fresh in everybody's minds. I don't know whether there's anything you want to add on that, Colin.
Absolutely. The day before the open date is our recommendation. Having said that, the open date is for the raters to have those conversations, for the participants to have those conversations with the raters. And the open date for us is always preceding the survey completion date, open date, because there's a time lag between the briefing and the participants nominating their raters online. So we recommend the day before you invite them to have those conversations. And in terms of timing of the actual event, we've managed to perfect it to a 60-minute event. We've got a little process. You've seen Belinda refer to that. You can get a link to that, and we've timed it to perfection. 60 minutes is fine, and that includes questions and answers.
Okay. So that really has described what we've done, is taken you through the content and a bit about the thinking in terms of why it's structured in the way it is, and how that can help remove some of those obstacles and really make the process a great success. We've got a few minutes, so really it's over to all of you for your questions and your thoughts in terms of what's been presented today.
Two reflections or questions, if you like, for me. One is around rater fatigue, given the number of assessments that people are perhaps doing in some of the larger organisations, I find. So I think that's perhaps more of a marker, you know, when you probably can't say when there is a best time to do it, but it's something I think that I've become more aware of over the years, and also to ask where there's an interest in what have you done recently or in the last year, where people are perhaps or have already been asked to rate, even if it's a different sort of cross section of people. And the other one, which is really disappointing, I find, is that if a particular line manager or an important stakeholder is being asked as a rater, that the participant thinks is really important to have as a rater, and they fail to respond. They're very busy people. Everybody's very busy, aren't they, these days? And obviously for some people it's a really big deal for them to get the rating of one particular individual who doesn't see that anywhere near as important and just doesn't respond to requests and emails. Do you have any thoughts on perhaps how to approach that one?
I think certainly in terms of your first comment, I think where you are rolling out a 360 program throughout an organization, I think it is very worthwhile investing some time thinking about your cohort structure. Who are the cohort? Who are likely to be the people that they invite, and how best to implement that across an organization. So yes, agree with that comment completely. I also agree about how disappointing it can be to a participant. And I think for us, with the process that we follow, and because we have that 10-step process, what we tend to find is it happens very, very rarely, because it's very difficult once you've asked somebody face to face and you have said to them how important something is and how it's going to impact me personally and how much I value your input. It's actually quite difficult for somebody not to do it. So I think that would be the way to try and minimize it, but I think it's very difficult to eliminate it completely.
I absolutely agree with Belinda, and in fact that link that Belinda's referred to, it's actually, you'll be able to do it from the slide deck. That link actually gives you, if you wish, gives you a script. It gives the participant a script to actually how to cover each of those 10 steps. They can choose to do their own thing, but it's quite prescriptive, that 10-step process, and it's almost in the last 15 minutes of awareness briefings when we're introducing this, it's almost like a coaching session to those participants in the room. But bearing in mind, we don't do these briefings to the raters, we only do it to the participants. But if we can get, and just other thing to add, by the way, next week's session is all about the best indications for 360. It's called Deploying the 360. That's when we're going to talk about, what's the right cultural conditions and so on and so forth for a 360 to be introduced. So we'll cover that in more depth. But assuming that you've got that right, then that invitation conversation will make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Oh, Anne, I can see that you want. Okay.
Sorry, I just switched it on. I put it off before. Sorry, I just found that really helpful and insightful. I'm just sort of on the periphery of getting to understand how you might roll out 360. And actually, one of my questions was, what level of maturity does really an organisation need to be at to consider that? So I think that's next week.
It's really next week. Yeah.
Culture. And also, we're just doing an appraisal review and putting some options together. So I'm not sure we're at the stage yet, but I guess the other question was, how simple can you make it? You know, that I guess that's another thing. I know you emphasised there keeping the briefing simple, but it's the overall how simple can you go? You know, before it, so it doesn't feel too complex a process.
Are you talking about the 360 process overall?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And I think there are ways that you can streamline the process so it becomes very slick. But almost, this is a personal opinion, I would say you don't want the process to be too simple. You don't want to simplify it too much, because otherwise you can sometimes negate or minimize the value that it actually has. I think for the organization to fully commit to it, it's what you do with the output. It's about people seeing what will be the return on the investment. So I think it's that balance, isn't it, between having something that's really going to add value and everyone can see the value it can add, as well as keeping it easy to use, easy to understand.
Yeah, and I think that ties in with the why that you said about the context. That's absolutely key. Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Thank you.
I mean, we are out of time, but I just want to add this very, very quickly. I've been doing this for nearly 35 years, would you believe, 360s. So I've got a lot of experience. We were one of the first companies to introduce it in the UK. What I will tell you is that overall, I have been surprised at how often the participant gets the positive strokes out of a 360. They get pleasantly surprised out of a 360. People write things that they hadn't assumed were important or had taken for granted. They had become complacent about that behavior. And a lot of the time, those positive strokes absolutely make the 360 a success. And a lot of that comes down to this briefing again, the 10 steps. Belinda, we're at the end. I wanted to thank you for your participation during the session. Thank you also to our guests. And if there are any further questions, my email address is at the top of the chat box, as is the link for the booking of any of the future sessions if you haven't already done so. So next week, we'll be covering the best indications for 360, how to select a 360 supplier, and how to implement the 360 in overall terms. So I hope you'll join us for that one. Have a good rest of the week. Stay safe, stay well. Bye for now.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.